It was a warm summer evening, and the man had just returned home after spending a fun-filled day outdoors with his friends. The air still carried the lingering scent of grilled food from the barbecue they'd enjoyed earlier. As he plopped down, into his favorite armchair, he felt the usual satisfaction that came with good company and great food. But something small caught his attention, a tiny red mark on his forearm. At first glance it seemed harmless, almost unnoticeable. Probably just a mosquito bite, he thought to himself, brushing it off without much concern. He scratched it absent-mindedly and leaned back, letting the fatigue of the day wash over him. But as the night wore on, that little mark began to nag at him, not because it hurt or itched excessively, but because it didn't feel like any ordinary bug bite. For one thing, it wasn't fading. By the time he got ready for bed, the spot looked slightly darker than before, and when he touched it, there was an odd tenderness beneath the skin. Still, he shrugged it off. Maybe he'd scratched it too hard during the day, or maybe it was just his imagination playing tricks on him. Either way, he decided not to let it ruin his mood. After all, it was just a small mark, nothing more. The next morning, however, things started to change. When he woke up and rolled out of bed, he glanced at his arm again. To his surprise, the tiny red mark had grown larger overnight. It wasn't just bigger, it was angrier looking, with edges that were darker and more defined. A closer inspection in the bathroom mirror revealed another unsettling detail. Faint streaks radiating outward from the center, almost like veins, but thicker and redder. He frowned, running a finger lightly over the area. It felt warm to the touch, tender enough to make him wince. At this point, he couldn't ignore it anymore. Something about the way it looked, and the way it made his arm throb ever so slightly, felt off. He tried telling himself it was probably nothing serious. Maybe it was some kind of allergic reaction. Or perhaps he'd brushed against poison ivy without realizing it. Whatever it was, he figured it would go away on its own in a day or two. So he slapped on some antiseptic cream, covered it with a bandage, and went about his day as usual. But as the hours ticked by, the situation only worsened. By lunchtime, the throbbing sensation had intensified. What had been a mild discomfort earlier now felt like a persistent pulse, matching the rhythm of his heartbeat. Every movement of his arm sent a sharp twinge through the affected area. When he peeled off the bandage to take another look, he was shocked to see how much worse it had gotten. The swelling had spread further up his arm, turning the once small mark into a large, angry patch of inflamed skin. And those streaks? They were even more pronounced now, standing out starkly against his flesh. A wave of unease washed over him. This wasn't normal. Bug bites didn't do this. Allergic reactions didn't escalate this quickly either. He began to feel feverish, alternating between sudden chills and uncomfortable sweats. His mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. Was it infected? Had he unknowingly picked up something dangerous while working outside? The questions swirled in his head, each one amplifying his growing anxiety. By the time his partner came home later that evening, he knew he couldn't brush it off any longer. "What's wrong?" his partner asked immediately, noticing the worried expression on his face. He hesitated for a moment, then showed them his arm. Their eyes widened at the sight of the swollen, discolored patch. "You need to see a doctor," they said firmly, leaving no room for argument. Reluctantly, he agreed. Deep down, though, he couldn't shake the sinking feeling that something far more serious was going on. The next morning, the man found himself sitting in a small, sterile clinic waiting for the doctor to call him in. The room was quiet except for the occasional rustle of papers and the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. He glanced around, at the other patients, some coughing, others scrolling through their phones, and tried to distract himself from the growing unease in his chest. His arm throbbed steadily under the bandage, a constant reminder of why he was here. When his name was finally called, he walked into the examination room feeling a mix of relief and dread. The doctor greeted him warmly but quickly shifted into professional mode as soon as she saw his arm. "Can you tell me what happened?" she asked, her voice calm but probing. He explained everything: the barbecue, the initial bug bite, how it had grown worse overnight, and the feverish symptoms that followed. As he spoke, the doctor's expression changed subtly. Her brows furrowed slightly, and she leaned in closer to examine the affected area. She unwrapped the bandage carefully, revealing the swollen, inflamed patch of skin. For a moment, she didn't say anything, just studied it intently. Then she pressed gently around the edges, asking if certain spots hurt more than others. Each touch sent a sharp jolt of pain through his arm, making him wince. "How long has it been like this?" she asked, her tone sharper now, more urgent. "Just since yesterday," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "It started small, but it's gotten worse really fast." The doctor nodded, though her expression remained serious. She began asking more questions. Had he been bitten by anything unusual recently? Had he spent time in wooded areas or near water where insects might carry diseases? Had he noticed any other symptoms besides the swelling and fever? He answered honestly, though his mind raced with worry. Why was she asking so many questions? What exactly was she thinking? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she stepped back and took a deep breath. "I want to run some tests," she said firmly. "This doesn't look like a typical infection. We need to figure out what we're dealing with." She scribbled something on her notepad and handed it to him. "Go to the lab down the hall. They'll draw some blood and send it for analysis. In the meantime, I'm going to start you on broad-spectrum antibiotics to be safe." Her words were meant to reassure him, but they only made his stomach churn. Broad-spectrum antibiotics? That sounded serious. And what did she mean by not a typical infection? He wanted to ask more, to demand answers right then and there. But he could see the determination in her eyes. She wasn't going to speculate until she had concrete information. All he could do was nod and follow her instructions. As he sat in the lab waiting area, watching the technician prepare the needle, his mind spiraled with possibilities. What if it was something rare? Something incurable? He'd heard stories about people getting sick from insect bites, Lyme disease, West Nile virus, but those seemed distant, almost fictional. Could something like that really happen to him? The technician's voice broke through his thoughts. "All right, let's get this done," she said kindly, tying a rubber band around his upper arm. He flinched as the needle pierced his skin, but the sting barely registered compared to the throbbing in his other arm. Back in the waiting room, time seemed to crawl. Every tick of the clock echoed loudly in his ears. He scrolled through his phone aimlessly, trying to focus on anything but the knot of fear tightening in his chest. Other patients came and went, chatting casually or flipping through magazines, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside him. Occasionally, he glanced at his arm, half expecting it to have gotten worse in the short time since he'd last checked. Thankfully, it looked the same. Or maybe that was just wishful thinking. After what felt like hours, the nurse finally called him back into the doctor's office. His heart pounded as he entered the room. The doctor was seated behind her desk, reviewing a sheet of paper. When she looked up, her expression was grave. "We have preliminary results," she began, her voice measured but heavy with concern. "And I need you to listen carefully because this is serious." His throat went dry. Serious? That word alone was enough to make his pulse quicken. "What is it?" he managed to choke out, gripping the edge of the chair tightly. The doctor paused, choosing her words carefully. "Based on the symptoms and the lab findings, we suspect you may have contracted necrotizing fasciitis, a condition commonly referred to as flesh-eating bacteria." The room seemed to spin for a moment. Flesh-eating bacteria? It sounded like something out of a nightmare, not real life. His mind struggled to process what she was saying. "Are you sure?" he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "We won't know for certain until further testing," she admitted. "But given the rapid progression and the appearance of your wound, it's highly likely. This is a very aggressive condition and we need to act fast to prevent it from spreading further." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. Aggressive, fast spreading. These weren't phrases anyone wanted to hear when talking about their health. Panic bubbled up inside him, but he forced himself to stay calm, or at least appear that way. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice trembling despite his best efforts. The doctor wasted no time laying out the plan. We'll start intravenous. Antibiotics immediately to combat the infection. You'll also need surgery to remove the damaged tissue and stop the bacteria from spreading. Time is critical here, so we'll prep you for the operating room as soon as possible. Surgery. Operating room. The words echoed in his head, surreal and terrifying. Just hours ago, he'd been worried about a simple bug bite. Now he was facing the possibility of losing part of his arm. Or worse. He nodded numbly, too overwhelmed to fully process everything she was saying. Okay, he whispered, clutching the armrests as if they were the only thing keeping him grounded. As the nurse led him to the treatment area, he couldn't help but wonder how life could change so drastically in such a short time. One tiny bug bite, that's all it took to bring him here, sitting in a hospital gown staring at the ceiling while IV lines were hooked up to his hand. Fear gnawed at him, but somewhere deep inside, a spark of hope flickered. If caught early, enough, the doctor had said, the chances of recovery were good. He clung to that thought as the world around him blurred into a haze of medical jargon and hurried footsteps. Whatever lay ahead, he told himself, he would face it, one step at a time. The man sat on the edge of the hospital bed, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. The coldness of the room seeped into his bones, but it wasn't just the temperature making him shiver. It was fear. Fear of the unknown. Fear of what lay ahead. He stared at the IV line taped to the back of his hand, watching the clear liquid drip steadily into his veins. The antibiotics were already flowing through him, fighting an invisible enemy that had taken hold so quickly. But even though the medicine was doing its job, he couldn't shake the feeling that time was slipping away. A nurse bustled into the room, her movements brisk and efficient. She checked the IV bag, adjusted the flow rate, and glanced at the monitor, tracking his vital signs. "How are you holding up?" she asked, her tone soft but professional. He forced a weak smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I've been better," he admitted, his voice hoarse. "When does the surgery happen?" "They're prepping the operating room now," she replied, giving him a reassuring nod. "You'll be in good hands. Our team is excellent, and they know exactly what they're doing." Her words were meant to comfort him, but they only made his mind race faster. What if something went wrong? What if the bacteria had spread too far for them to stop it? He'd heard stories about flesh-eating infections before, how they could escalate within hours, leaving devastation in their wake. Was he already too late? As if sensing his anxiety, the nurse placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Try to focus on the positives," she said softly. "You caught this early, and that's huge. Early treatment makes all the difference." Early treatment. Those two words echoed in his head. If he hadn't gone to the clinic when he did, would things have spiraled out of control? Would he be lying in a hospital bed somewhere else fighting for his life? The thought sent a fresh wave of panic coursing through him, but he pushed it down. There was no use dwelling on what-ifs. All he could do now was trust the doctors and hope for the best. A short while later, a surgeon entered the room. He introduced himself with a firm handshake and a calm demeanor that immediately put the man at ease, or as much ease as someone in his situation could feel. The surgeon explained the procedure in detail. They would cut away the infected tissue to prevent the bacteria from spreading further. It sounded brutal, almost barbaric, but he nodded along anyway. He didn't have a choice. This wasn't about vanity or pride. It was about survival. "We'll do everything we can to save as much of your arm as possible," the surgeon assured him. "But I won't lie to you, this is serious. We might need to remove more tissue than expected, depending on how deep the infection has gone." The man swallowed hard, his throat dry despite the water bottle sitting on the bedside table. Will I lose my arm?" he asked hesitantly, the question hanging heavy in the air. The surgeon hesitated for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "It's unlikely, given how soon we're intervening. But we won't know the full extent until we get in there. Just know that our priority is saving your life. Everything else comes second." His stomach churned at the thought of waking up missing part of himself. His arm was more than just flesh and bone. It was a tool, a means of working, creating, living. Losing it would change everything. But he reminded himself of what the nurse had said earlier. Early treatment makes all the difference. Maybe, just maybe, he'd gotten here in time. Before he knew it, a gurney arrived to take him to the operating room. As they wheeled him down, the long, brightly lit hallway, he stared up at the ceiling tiles, trying to steady his breathing. Each bump of the wheels against the floor felt like a countdown to something monumental. He closed his eyes, focusing on the rhythmic sound of the gurney rolling forward. Inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. When they reached the OR, the staff greeted him warmly, their voices cheerful yet clinical. They transferred him onto the operating table, covering him with thin blankets to keep him warm. An anesthesiologist leaned over him, explaining the sedation process. "You won't feel a thing," she promised. "Just count backward from 10 and you'll drift off." He nodded, gripping the edge of the table tightly. 10, 9, 8. By the time he reached 5, the world around him began to blur. 4, 3. His eyelids grew heavier, and the bright lights above faded into darkness. 2, 1. The next thing he knew, he was waking up in the recovery room. The first sensation that hit him was grogginess, followed by a dull ache in his arm. He blinked slowly, adjusting to the dim light. A nurse stood nearby, checking the monitors and jotting notes on her clipboard. When she noticed he was awake, she smiled warmly. "Welcome back," she said. "How are you feeling?" "Like I got hit by a truck," he croaked, his voice barely audible. His throat felt raw, and his body ached all over. But the pain in his arm, that sharp throbbing pain, was gone. Instead, it felt numb, wrapped tightly in bandages. "That's normal after surgery," the nurse reassured him. "You did great. The doctors are pleased with how things went." Pleased? That was a good sign, right? He wanted to ask more, to demand details, but exhaustion pulled at him like a heavy blanket. His eyelids drooped, and sleep claimed him once, again. Hours later, when he woke up fully, the surgeon came to check on him. Pulling up a chair beside the bed, the doctor explained what had happened during the operation. "We removed the infected tissue successfully," he said, his tone cautious, but hopeful. "It looks like we caught it in time, but we'll need to monitor you closely over the next few days. There's still a chance the infection could come back, so we're keeping you on strong antibiotics." Relief washed over him, though it was tinged with lingering worry. Caught it in time. Those words repeated in his mind like a mantra. He'd survived, for now. But the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Recovery would take weeks, maybe months. Physical therapy would be grueling, and the scars, both physical and emotional, would remind him every day of how close he'd come to losing everything. As he lay there staring at the ceiling, he realized something profound. Life was fragile. One tiny bug bite had brought him face to face with mortality, forcing him to confront fears he never imagined he'd have to deal with. Yet here he was, alive and breathing. And for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to feel grateful, not just for surviving, but for the people who cared enough to help him through it. The days that followed the surgery felt like a blur of pain, uncertainty, and slow, incremental progress. The man woke up each morning to the same sterile hospital room, the hum of machines filling the silence. His arm was heavily bandaged, and, though the sharp throbbing had subsided, a dull ache lingered, a constant reminder of what his body had endured. Nurses came and went, checking his vitals, changing dressings, and asking him questions about how he was feeling. Every day they told him the same thing. "You're doing well. Just take it one step at a time." But taking it one step at a time wasn't as easy as it sounded. Each passing hour brought new challenges. For starters, there was the physical toll. The antibiotics coursing through his veins left him feeling weak and nauseous, while the surgical wound required meticulous care to prevent further complications. Then there was the emotional weight. the fear that the infection might return, stronger and more aggressive than before. Even with the doctor's reassurances, he couldn't shake the nagging thought that this nightmare wasn't fully over. His partner visited every evening after work, bringing small comforts from home, a favorite snack, a playlist of soothing music, or just a familiar presence to break the monotony. They sat together in quiet companionship, sometimes talking, other times simply sitting side by side. During these moments, the man found solace in knowing he wasn't alone. Still, there were times when the reality of his situation overwhelmed him. One night, as his partner held his hand, he broke down. "I can't stop thinking about it," he admitted, his voice trembling. "What if I lose my arm? What if this happens again? How am I supposed to move past something like this?" His partner listened patiently, offering words of encouragement without trying to minimize his fears. "You've already come so far," they said gently. "You survived something most people wouldn't even imagine facing. That says a lot about your strength. Don't let the what-ifs steal your peace right now." Their advice stuck with him, planting a seed of resilience deep within. He realized that while he couldn't control everything, his recovery, the outcome, or the future, he could choose how he responded to it. Little by little, he began focusing on the positives. The swelling in his arm was going down. The streaks of redness that had once spread alarmingly fast were fading. And most importantly, he was still here, alive and breathing. Physical therapy started a few weeks later, once the doctors deemed him stable enough to begin rebuilding strength in his arm. At first, the sessions were grueling. Simple movements like lifting a lightweight dumbbell or stretching his fingers felt impossible. Pain shot through his arm with every attempt, leaving him frustrated and exhausted. But the therapist was patient, guiding him through exercises tailored to his condition. "It's not about speed," she reminded him. "It's about consistency. Every tiny improvement counts." He clung to her words, pushing himself despite the discomfort. Slowly, ever so slowly, he noticed changes. His grip became firmer. The stiffness in his joints eased slightly, and though the scar tissue around the wound remained tender, it no longer felt like a foreign part of him. Progress, no matter how small, gave him hope. It reminded him that healing wasn't linear. It ebbed and flowed, but it was happening nonetheless. During one particularly tough session, the therapist shared stories of other patients who had overcome similar challenges. There was a man who lost nearly half his leg to an infection, she recalled. He didn't think he'd walk again, but with determination and support, he learned to run marathons. You'd never guess what he went through unless he told you. Her story struck a chord. If someone else could rebuild their life after such devastation, why couldn't he? Inspiration fueled his resolve, and he pushed harder in the weeks that followed. By the end of each session, sweat dripped from his brow and his muscles burned with exertion, but he wore a satisfied smile. He was getting stronger, one painful rep at a time. As his physical recovery progressed, so did his emotional healing. The man started journaling, pouring his thoughts onto paper as a way to process everything he'd been through. Writing became a form of therapy, allowing him to confront his fears and celebrate his victories no matter how small. On bad days, he wrote about the frustration of setbacks. On good days, he documented milestones, the first time he could lift a cup without help, the first time he felt the sun on his face without shivering from fever, the first time he laughed without guilt or fear clouding the moment. One entry stood out among the rest. "I used to think survival meant escaping danger unscathed. Now I know better. Survival is messy, painful, and imperfect. It's learning to live with scars, not just the ones on your skin, but the ones inside you too. And somehow that makes it all the more beautiful." Sharing his journey also became an important part of his recovery. Encouraged by his partner, he began posting updates online, detailing his experience for others who might find themselves in similar situations. At first he hesitated. Would anyone care? Would sharing something so personal make him vulnerable? But the response surprised him. Messages poured in from strangers thanking him for raising awareness about rare infections and inspiring them. to seek medical help early. Some shared their own stories of battling illnesses, creating a sense of community he hadn't expected. Through these connections, he discovered a newfound purpose. What had initially felt like a cruel twist of fate transformed into an opportunity to educate and advocate. He started researching necrotizing fasciitis, learning everything he could about its causes, symptoms, and treatments. Armed with knowledge, he spoke at local health events, urging people to listen to their bodies and seek help immediately if something seemed off. "Don't ignore the signs," he often said during these talks. "A bug bite may seem harmless, but sometimes it's the smallest things that can change your life forever." By the time he was discharged from the hospital, he felt like a different person, not just physically, but emotionally and mentally. The road ahead was still long, filled with ongoing therapy and regular checkups, but he faced it with a renewed sense of gratitude and determination. Life, he realized, was unpredictable. It could test you in ways you never imagined. But it could also teach you resilience, humility, and the importance of cherishing every moment. Standing in front of the mirror one morning, he examined the scars on his arm. They were jagged and raw, a permanent reminder of his brush with mortality. Yet instead of seeing them as flaws, he saw them as symbols of survival. He traced the lines lightly with his fingers, whispering to himself, "You made it through." And for the first time in months, he truly believed it. As the weeks turned into months, the man's life began to settle into a new rhythm. The initial shock of his illness had faded, replaced by the daily grind of recovery. His mornings started early, often with a cup of coffee and a few minutes of quiet reflection. He'd sit by the window watching the sunrise paint the sky in hues of orange and pink, reminding himself how lucky he was to witness another day. Those moments of stillness became sacred to him, a way to ground himself before diving into the challenges ahead. Physical therapy remained a cornerstone of his routine, though it no longer felt as daunting as it once did. The exercises that had once left him breathless and defeated now brought a sense of accomplishment. Each session pushed him closer to reclaiming his strength, and he celebrated every milestone, no matter how small. One day, after successfully lifting a heavier weight than before, he grinned at his therapist. "I think I'm getting the hang of this," he joked, flexing his arm proudly. "You're doing great," she replied, her smile genuine. "But remember, healing isn't just about your body. It's about your mind, too." Her words stuck with him long after the session ended. Healing his mind, that was a battle he hadn't fully acknowledged until recently. While his body showed visible signs of progress, his thoughts often wandered back to those dark days in the hospital. What if the infection had spread further? What if he hadn't sought help in time? These questions haunted him, lingering like shadows in the corners of his mind. To combat these intrusive thoughts, he leaned on the tools he'd discovered during his recovery: journaling, meditation, and talking openly with his partner. They would sit together in the evenings, sharing their highs and lows from the day. Sometimes they laughed about silly things, like the time he accidentally spilled an entire bowl of soup on himself during dinner. Other times, they delved into deeper topics like fear, gratitude, and the fragility of life. These conversations helped him process his emotions, turning his inner turmoil into something tangible and manageable. One evening, as they sat on the couch flipping through old photo albums, his partner paused on a picture of him working outside. In the photo, he was shirtless, sweat glistening on his skin as he hammered nails into a wooden frame. His arms were strong and tanned, free of any scars. For a moment, he stared at the image, feeling a pang of nostalgia for the person he used to be. "Do you miss it?" his partner asked softly, noticing the look on his face. He hesitated before answering. "Not really," he said finally. "I mean, yeah, I miss being able to do things without thinking twice, but I don't miss taking my health for granted. This whole experience has taught me to appreciate my body more, not just what it can do, but also its limitations." His partner nodded thoughtfully. "It's like you've been given a second chance," she said. "Not everyone gets that." The idea of a second chance resonated deeply with him. He realized that surviving necrotizing fasciitis wasn't just about beating an infection, it was about rediscovering who he was and what mattered most to him. Before the illness, he'd spent years chasing goals that now seemed trivial. Promotions, at work, material possessions, societal validation. Now his priorities had shifted. Spending quality time with loved ones, pursuing hobbies that brought him joy, and simply being present in the moment took precedence over everything else. This shift in perspective inspired him to make changes in his life. He cut back on overtime at work, opting instead to spend weekends exploring nature or tinkering on passion projects around the house. One Saturday, he decided to build a birdhouse from scratch. It was a simple project, nothing fancy, but it gave him immense satisfaction. As he sanded down the rough edges of the wood, he marveled at how far he'd come. Just months ago, holding a hammer felt like an impossible feat. Now he was creating something with his own two hands. Word of his advocacy efforts continued to spread, opening doors he never expected. Local newspapers reached out for interviews, wanting to share his story with a wider audience. At first, he felt hesitant about stepping into the spotlight. Wasn't he just an ordinary guy who happened to survive an extraordinary ordeal? But then he remembered why he started speaking out in the first place, to educate others and potentially save lives. With that mission in mind, he agreed to the interviews, using each opportunity to emphasize the importance of early detection and treatment. During one interview, a reporter asked him a question that stopped him in his tracks. "What advice would you give to someone going through something similar?" He paused, collecting his thoughts. "I'd tell them to hold on," he said finally. "No matter how hard it gets, just hold on. There will be days when you feel like giving up, but trust me, there's light at the end of the tunnel. And don't be afraid to ask for help, whether it's from doctors, friends, or family. You don't have to go through this alone." His answer struck a chord with readers and viewers alike. Messages poured in from people thanking him for his honesty and vulnerability. Some shared stories of their own struggles, while others expressed gratitude for the awareness he'd raised. One message stood out in particular. "Your story saved my life. I went to the doctor because of what you said, and they caught an infection early. Thank you." Reading those words filled him with a sense of purpose he'd never felt before. If sharing his experience could make even a small difference in someone else's life, then everything he'd endured was worth it. Despite the progress he'd made, there were still moments of frustration. Simple tasks that used to take seconds now required extra effort. Opening jars, tying shoelaces, even writing, things he once did without thinking, now demanded patience and perseverance. On tough days, he reminded himself of how far he'd come. Instead of focusing on what he couldn't do, he celebrated what he could. Each small victory, no matter how insignificant it seemed, was proof that he was moving forward. One afternoon, while walking through the park, he noticed a group of kids playing soccer. Their laughter echoed across the field, carefree and infectious. He watched them for a while, marveling at their energy and innocence. A memory surfaced from his childhood. A summer afternoon spent kicking a ball around with neighborhood friends. Inspired, he decided to try joining a local recreational league. It wouldn't be competitive, just a casual way to stay active and meet new people. Signing up for the league felt like taking a leap of faith. Could he keep up? Would his arm hold up under the strain? Doubts crept in, but he pushed them aside. On his first day, he arrived early, nerves buzzing beneath his skin. As the game began, he focused on enjoying himself rather than performing perfectly. By the end of the match, he was drenched in sweat and grinning ear to ear. Sure, he wasn't as fast or agile as he used to be, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that he was out there, living and loving life again. That night, as he lay in bed replaying the game in his mind, he felt a profound sense of peace. Life had thrown him a curveball, one that nearly knocked him out of the game entirely. Yet here he was, not just surviving but thriving. Every scar, every challenge, every setback had shaped him into someone stronger, wiser, and more grateful. For the first time in a long time, He fell asleep with a heart full of hope, ready to embrace whatever tomorrow might bring. The man's journey wasn't just about physical recovery. It was also about rediscovering joy in the little things. As he adjusted to his new normal, he found himself noticing details he'd once overlooked, like the way sunlight filtered through, leaves on a crisp autumn morning, or the sound of rain tapping against the window late at night. These moments, though small, brought him immense comfort and reminded him how beautiful life could be when you slowed down enough to appreciate it. One of the biggest changes in his life was his relationship with fear. Before the illness, he'd been someone who prided himself on being tough, someone who didn't let setbacks get in his way. But now, fear wasn't something he brushed aside. It was something he acknowledged and worked through. He realized that fear wasn't necessarily a bad thing. It could be a guide, pointing out areas where he needed to grow stronger or pay closer attention. Instead of running from it, he learned to sit with it, to listen to what it was trying to tell him. This newfound understanding of fear came in handy during one particularly challenging phase of his recovery. A routine checkup revealed that while the infection was under control, some nerve damage in his arm might take longer to heal, or may never fully resolve. The news hit him hard. Would he ever regain full function? Would this limitation follow him for the rest of his life? For a few days he spiraled into self-doubt, questioning whether all his hard work had been worth it. But then, something shifted. During a therapy session, his physical therapist asked him a simple yet powerful question. What can you do today that you couldn't do last month? At first he hesitated. Wasn't the real question what he couldn't do? But as he thought about it, he began listing accomplishments, not big ones, but meaningful ones. He could grip objects more firmly than before. He could lift his arm higher without pain. He could type on his phone without needing both hands. Each item on the list made him realize how much progress he'd made, even if there was still a long road ahead. That's amazing, his therapist said with a smile. Progress doesn't have to mean perfection. It means moving forward, no matter how slow. Her words stuck with him. From that day on, he stopped comparing himself to who he used to be and started celebrating who he was becoming. He embraced the idea that healing wasn't about returning to an old version of himself. It was about creating a new one, scars and all. This mindset shift gave him a sense of freedom he hadn't felt in months. He stopped worrying so much about the future and focused instead on making each day count. Another turning point came when he decided to revisit one of his favorite childhood hobbies, painting. Growing up, he'd spent hours sketching and experimenting with colors, losing himself in the creative process. But as an adult, life had gotten busy, and he'd set the hobby aside. Now, inspired by a friend's suggestion, he picked up a brush, again. At first, holding it felt awkward. The muscles in his hand weren't as steady as they used to be, but he persisted. Slowly, shapes began to emerge on the canvas. Swirls of blue and green blended into waves, while streaks of yellow and orange formed a glowing sun. By the time he stepped back to admire his work, tears welled up in his eyes. Painting again felt like reconnecting with a part of himself he'd almost forgotten existed. Encouraged by the experience, he signed up for a local art class. Walking into the studio for the first time, he felt nervous but excited. Most of the other students were younger, their hands moving effortlessly across their canvases. For a moment he wondered if he belonged there. But then he remembered. This wasn't about comparing himself to others. It was about finding joy in the act of creation. Over time, he grew more confident, not only in his artistic abilities but also in his ability to try new things despite his limitations. Art became a form of therapy for him, a way to express emotions he struggled to put into words. One piece, titled Resilience, depicted a tree growing out of cracked earth, its branches reaching toward the sky. The trunk was scarred, twisted from years of weathering storms, but it stood tall nonetheless. When he shared the painting with his partner, they hugged him tightly, saying, "This is you, strong, beautiful, and unbreakable." As word of his artwork spread, people began asking to buy his pieces. At first he laughed off the idea. He wasn't a professional artist after all. But when a local cafe owner offered to display some of his paintings, he agreed. Seeing his work hanging on the walls, admired by strangers, filled him with pride. It was another reminder that his journey wasn't defined by loss, but by growth and transformation. His advocacy efforts continued to gain momentum as well. After several successful speaking engagements, he was invited to participate in a health awareness campaign aimed at educating communities about rare infections. Standing on stage in front of hundreds of people, he felt a mix of nerves and excitement. As he spoke about his experience, he noticed heads nodding in understanding, eyes widening in realization. When he finished, the applause was thunderous, and dozens of attendees lined up to thank him personally. One woman approached him with tears in her eyes. "My son has necrotizing fasciitis," she said, her voice trembling. "Hearing your story gives me hope that he'll make it through too." Her words stayed with him long after the event ended, reinforcing the impact his story could have on others. Despite all the positives, there were still moments of vulnerability. Some nights, lying awake in bed, he wrestled with questions about why this had happened to him. Why had a tiny bug bite turned into such a life-altering ordeal? There were no easy answers, only the knowledge that sometimes life throws challenges our way for reasons we may never fully understand. What mattered most was how we responded to those challenges, and he knew he was responding with courage and resilience. By the end of the year, he looked back on everything he'd been through and marveled at how far he'd come. His arm still bore scars, reminders of the battle he'd fought and won. Yet those scars no longer represented pain or weakness. They symbolized strength, survival, and the beauty of second chances. Life, he realized, wasn't about avoiding storms. It was about learning to dance in the rain. And for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face whatever storms lay ahead. As the months rolled on, the man began to embrace life in ways he hadn't imagined possible before his illness. Each day felt like a gift, and he made it a point to live intentionally, focusing not just on surviving, but thriving. He started waking up earlier, savoring the quiet moments before the world around him came alive. Whether it was sipping coffee while watching the sunrise or jotting down thoughts in his journal, these rituals grounded him and reminded him of how precious each new day truly was. One of the most surprising developments during this time was the deepening of his relationships with those closest to him. Before the ordeal, he'd often been so caught up in work and daily responsibilities that he rarely paused to connect meaningfully with others. But now, every conversation, every shared laugh, felt richer and more significant. His partner, who had stood by him through the darkest days, became an even stronger pillar of support. They spent evenings cooking together, experimenting with recipes they'd always wanted to try but never had the time for. On weekends, they took long walks in the park, talking about everything from their dreams to their fears. These moments weren't just about rebuilding their bond, they were about rediscovering the joy of simply being together. His friendships also evolved in unexpected ways. Old friends he hadn't spoken to in years reached out after hearing about his journey. Some sent heartfelt messages, while others invited him over for dinner or coffee. What struck him most was how much people cared, not just about his recovery, but about reconnecting with him as a person. One evening, a group of buddies surprised him with a small gathering at his house. They brought board games, snacks, and plenty of good-natured teasing. For hours, they laughed until their sides hurt, temporarily forgetting the weight of the past year. In that moment, surrounded by people who genuinely loved him, he realized how healing connection could be. But it wasn't just personal relationships that flourished. His connection to his community grew stronger too. Through his advocacy work, he found himself meeting people from all walks of life, each with their own stories of struggle and resilience. At first, he worried that sharing his experience publicly might make him feel exposed or vulnerable. Instead, it opened doors to conversations that were both humbling and inspiring. People approached him after talks or events to share their own battles, whether with illness, loss, or hardship, and thanked him for giving them hope. Hearing these stories reinforced his belief that everyone carries burdens unseen, and sometimes Simply knowing you're not alone can make all the difference. One particular encounter stayed with him long after it happened. A young woman approached him at a health fair where he was speaking. She looked nervous, clutching a notebook tightly against her chest. "I don't know if I should tell you this," she began hesitantly, "but your story saved my dad's life." Her voice cracked as she explained how her father had dismissed what seemed like a minor injury, a scratch from gardening, but developed alarming symptoms days later. Remembering the man's advice about seeking help early, she insisted they go to the hospital. Doctors diagnosed her father with sepsis, a condition similar to necrotizing fasciitis, and treated him just in time. "If it weren't for you," she said, tears streaming down her face, "he wouldn't be here today." The weight of her words hit him like a wave. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about creating ripples of change that extended far beyond his own life. Knowing that his story had touched someone else's family filled him with a sense of purpose he couldn't put into words. That night, as he drove home, he replayed the conversation in his mind, feeling a mix of gratitude and responsibility. If his experience could inspire even one person to act quickly or seek help, then every painful step of his journey had been worth it. Despite the progress he'd made, there were still challenges to face. Physical therapy sessions continued, though less frequently now, and some tasks remained difficult. Simple things like chopping vegetables or opening jars required extra effort, reminding him that his body would never be exactly the same as it was before. Yet instead of dwelling on what he'd lost, he focused on adapting. He invested in tools designed for people with limited mobility, learning new techniques to accomplish everyday tasks. Each small victory, like mastering the use of a jar opener or finishing a puzzle with shaky hands, felt monumental. Art continued to play a central role in his life, becoming both a passion and a form of self-expression. His paintings evolved over time, reflecting his emotional journey. Early pieces were dark and chaotic, filled with jagged lines and muted colors. But as he healed, his work brightened, incorporating vibrant hues and flowing shapes. One painting, titled Renewal, depicted a phoenix rising from ashes, its wings ablaze with fiery reds and golds. When he unveiled it at a local art show, attendees crowded around, captivated by its energy and symbolism. Someone asked him what inspired the piece, and he smiled softly. "It's about rebirth," he said, "about finding beauty in the broken parts." The response to his artwork encouraged him to dream bigger. He began exploring opportunities to collaborate with other artists and organizations, using his platform to raise awareness about health issues. Together, they hosted exhibitions that combined visual art, poetry, and music, creating spaces where people could share their stories and find solace in community. These events weren't just about showcasing talent. They were about fostering connection and reminding people that they weren't alone in their struggles. Amidst all the growth and transformation, there were moments when he allowed himself to reflect on how far he'd come. Late one night, sitting by the window with a cup of tea, he flipped through old photos from the months following his diagnosis. Pictures of him lying in a hospital bed, pale and frail, stared back at him. He remembered the fear, the uncertainty, the countless sleepless nights. And yet here he was now, stronger, wiser, and full of gratitude. The contrast between then and now was staggering. He thought about the lessons he'd learned along the way, the importance of listening to your body, the power of resilience, and the value of leaning on others when times got tough. Most importantly, he realized that adversity didn't have to define you. It could refine you, shaping you into someone capable of facing life's storms with courage and grace. By the time spring arrived, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Life wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was beautiful in its imperfections. Every scar, every challenge, every triumph had taught him something invaluable. As he stepped outside one sunny morning, feeling the warmth of the sun on his skin, he whispered a silent thank you to the universe. Not for sparing him pain, but for showing him the strength within himself. Whatever lay ahead, he knew he was ready to face it, one step, one breath, one heartbeat at a time. As the seasons changed and another year approached, the man found himself reflecting on how much his life had transformed. What had started as a terrifying brush with mortality had turned into a journey of growth, resilience, and discovery. He wasn't the same person he'd been before that fateful bug bite, and he didn't want to be. The challenges he'd faced had stripped away layers of complacency, forcing him to confront fears, embrace vulnerability, and rediscover what truly mattered. One crisp autumn morning, he decided to take a solo hike, a simple act that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. The trail wound through a forest ablaze with golden and crimson leaves, sunlight filtering through the canopy above. As he walked, he noticed the subtle crunch of fallen leaves beneath his boots and the cool breeze brushing against his skin. It was peaceful, almost meditative. Every step felt like a testament to how far he'd come, not just physically but emotionally and mentally. Halfway up the trail, he stopped at a clearing overlooking a serene lake. Sitting on a rock, he pulled out a small notebook from his backpack. Over the past year, journaling had become a lifeline for him, a way to process his thoughts and document his progress. Today he wanted to write about gratitude. He flipped open the pages and began listing everything he was thankful for: his partner's unwavering support, the kindness of strangers who'd shared their stories, the doctors and nurses who had saved his life, the therapists who helped him rebuild his strength, and even the little things like the warmth of the sun or the sound of birds chirping in the distance. But one entry stood out among the rest. "I'm grateful for myself, for not giving up, even when it felt easier to let go." Reading those words aloud made his chest tighten with emotion. For so long he'd doubted his ability to overcome such a daunting challenge. Yet here he was, standing and sitting as proof that perseverance could move mountains or at least climb them. When he returned home later that day, his partner greeted him with a warm smile. "How was the hike?" they asked, handing him a steaming mug of hot chocolate. "It was incredible," he replied, his eyes lighting up. "I think I needed that, to remind myself of how strong I am." His partner nodded knowingly. "You've earned this moment, you know. All of it. Every step forward, every victory, no matter how big or small." Her words resonated deeply. They weren't just talking about the hike, they were talking about the entire journey. From the early days of uncertainty in the hospital to the grueling months of physical therapy, every effort had led him to this point, a place where he could look back without regret and ahead with hope. The following weeks brought more milestones. His artwork continued to gain recognition, and he was invited to speak at a national health conference. Standing on stage in front of thousands of people, he felt a mix of nerves and excitement. This time, however, the fear didn't paralyze him, it fueled him. As he recounted his story, he noticed the audience leaning forward, hanging onto his every word. When he finished, the applause was thunderous, lasting far longer than he expected. Dozens of attendees lined up afterward to shake his hand, hug him, or simply thank him for sharing his experience. One woman stood out in particular. She introduced herself as a nurse who specialized in treating patients with rare infections. "Your story is exactly what we need more of," she said earnestly. "Awareness saves lives. Thank you for being brave enough to share yours." Her comment stayed with him long after the event ended. Awareness saves lives. Those 4 words encapsulated everything he'd worked toward over the past year. If telling his story could inspire others to seek help early, advocate for themselves, or simply believe in their ability to overcome adversity, then every painful moment of his journey had been worth it. Back home, he began planning new projects, ways to expand his advocacy efforts beyond speeches and interviews. He collaborated with local schools to create educational workshops about recognizing symptoms of serious infections. He partnered with artists to design murals in public spaces that highlighted themes of resilience and hope. And he launched an online platform where people could share their own stories of survival, creating a community built on mutual understanding and encouragement. Through all these endeavors, he remained grounded by staying connected to the basics, the simple joys that reminded him why life was worth fighting for. On weekends, he spent hours gardening, planting flowers and vegetables in the backyard. Watching seeds sprout and grow mirrored his own journey. Slow, steady progress rooted in patience and care. In the evenings, he cooked elaborate meals, experimenting with flavors and techniques he'd never tried before. Food became not just sustenance but a celebration of life itself. There were still moments of doubt, of course. Some nights, lying awake in bed, he wondered if he'd ever fully escape the shadow of his illness. Would there always be a part of him waiting for the other shoe to drop? But instead of letting those thoughts consume him, he acknowledged them and moved on. Fear was natural. It was how you responded to it that defined you. By the end of the here he realized something profound. Healing wasn't a destination, it was a journey. There would always be scars, both visible and invisible, but they didn't diminish his worth or his potential. Instead, they added depth to his story, reminding him of the battles he'd fought and won. Life wasn't about avoiding pain. It was about finding meaning in it, using it to grow stronger and kinder. On New Year's Eve, surrounded by loved ones, he raised a glass to toast the future. To second chances, he said, his voice steady and full of conviction, and to living every day like it's a gift. As fireworks lit up the sky outside, he felt a deep sense of peace. The road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but he was ready. He had faced the unimaginable and emerged stronger because of it. Whatever storms might come, he knew he could weather them, not because he was fearless, but because he had learned to face fear head-on. For the first time in a long time, he felt truly alive, not just surviving, but thriving. And as he looked around at the faces of those he loved, glowing in the light of the new year, he whispered softly to himself, "This is living."